Good day, I am Dingal Liza Mae C, and I will be reporting Module 2. So first, the history of philosophy and the objectives of imprisonment and the development of presence. The history of imprisonment. The initial goal of holding someone in a prison was not to punish them, but to keep the perpetrator of a crime held until the proper penalty could be administered. This was mainly in the form of corporal punishment, such as being whipped with a whip, or capital punishment, which is used a variety of means to claim the lives of those who had been sentenced to death. So, punishment is depicted as an intense collective phenomenon driven by a rational forces. So it was seen as rituals expressing the furious moral outrage of the group against those who had violated its sacred moral order. So imprisonment is seen as an intimidating relationship between the state and the offender, which is the central image underlying many critical studies of imposing penalty. And it can also be represented as a legal procedure, as a form of power and instrument of class domination, an expression of collective feeling, a moral action, or a ritual event of an embodiment of a certain sensibility. And also imprisonment can settle society's means of dealing with certain needs, relationships, conflicts, and problems which repeatedly recur. And um, in during this history, uh, the form of punishment is like corporal and also the capital punishment. Next is London is known as the birthplace of modern imprisonment. By the 19th century, prisons were being built for the sole purpose of housing inmates. They were intended to deter people from committing crimes. People who were found guilty of various crimes would be sent to these penitentiaries and stripped of their personal freedoms. And also, inmates were often forced to do hard labor while they were incarcerated and to live in very harsh conditions. So, during this century, prisons were being created for the exclusive purpose of housing inmates by the 19th century. So, they were designed to prevent criminals from committing crimes, and people convicted of a various offenses would be transferred to these prisons and their personal liberties would be taken away. So inmates were frequently forced to work and hard labor and also live in deplorable conditions while in jail. So inmates rehabilitation became one of the purposes of jail sentence before long. Next, an opposing view point to the rehabilitative effects of imprisonment claims that being incarcerated will actually cause people to become even more involved with a life of crime because they become so enveloped in a criminal society while living with other inmates. So, many individuals believe that the threat of being imprisoned would stop a convict from committing another crime, but others believe that policies should be put in place to help criminals improve before they were released. And mental tests, like educational programs and even far more serious treatments such as electroshock therapy, are all part of these strategies. So, according to a counter argument to the therapeutic effects of jail, being incarcerated causes people to become even more committed in a life of crime since they are so immersed in a criminal environment while living with other convicts. Regardless of these divergent viewpoints on criminal rehabilitation, incarceration remains one of the most popular types of punishment around the world. Next is the development of the prison system. During the 16th century, a number of houses of correction were established in Europe for the rehabilitation of minor offenders, and the VAR grants, they emphasize strict discipline and hard labor. Prison became considered as a suitable method of punishing guilty criminals over time, and poor sanitation in these prisons resulted in widespread sickness among the inmates who were uh, housed in large groups without regard for gender or legal status. So in this slide, outbreaks of epidemic typhus, sometimes known as a jail fever, have killed not just inmates but also jailers, judges, and lawyers participating in trials or rare occasions. The contemporary presence arose in response to the conditions of the local jails of the time in the late 18th century. So, the purpose of imprisonment, there are a number of accepted reasons for the use of imprisonment. One approach aims to deter those who would otherwise commit crimes, or the general deterrence, and to make it less likely that those who serve a prison sentence will commit crimes after their release, or the individual deterrence. A second approach focuses on issuing punishment to or obtaining retribution from those who have committed serious crimes. A third approach encourages the personal reform of those who are sent to prison. So the purpose of imprisonment for the one approach aims to deter those who would otherwise commit crimes, or what we call the general deterrence. And the approach based on general deterrence aims to dissuade others from following the offenders. Example for this is less concern with the future behavior of the offender himself. General deterrence theories assume that because most individuals are rational, potential offenders will calculate the risk of being similarly caught, prosecuted, and sentenced for the commission of a crime. So deterrence has proven difficult to validate, however, largely because the presence of many intervening factors makes it difficult to prove unequivocally that a certain penalty has prevented someone from committing a given crime. In general, deterrence through fear is aimed at those who avoid law breaking behavior not on moral grounds but on the basis of a calculation of the potential rewards and penalties involved. So, and also to make it less likely that those who serve a prison sentence will commit crimes after the release. So, or what we call the individual sentence. So, in this individual deterrence, is directed at the person being punished, and also it aims to teach him not to repeat the behavior. And it is also the rationale of much informal punishment, such as parental punishment of children. So, lastly, in some situations, it is vital to safeguard the public from criminals, particularly those who commit crimes on a regular basis. All, all or more of these justifications may be applicable in specific instances. So, next, types of prisons. Prisoners are distributed among a variety of types of institutions. Most countries operate national prison systems that are supplemented by state or provincial counterparts. So there are many types of prisons, or the types of institution. Most of the countries also operate and by the state or provincial counterparts. So first, let's talk about juvenile. An individual under the age of 18 is considered a juvenile. Anyone who is not of a legal age is never locked up in a general prison with adult. They are instead placed in a facility that is designed exclusively for juveniles only, or for the under age of 18 years old. Juvenile was established to rehabilitate children and confirms that locking children up for too long periods of time, especially under the harsh conditions that we see all too frequently in the juvenile system, causes more harm than good and thus lethal to protect our communities, and also children deserve better. Next, the minimum, medium, and high security. So in the next slide, we tackle this about. So minimum security presence are usually reserved for white collar criminals who have committed acts such as embezzlement or fraud. Although these are serious crimes, they are non-violent in nature, and therefore the perpetrators are not considered to be a risk for violence. These perpetrators are sent to facilities that offer a dormitory type living environment, fewer guards, and more personal freedom. So a jail where inmates are given more freedom than they would be in most other prisons, since they are not deemed dangerous or likely to flee. And also the minimum security prisons have the flimsiest level of security. Not all inmates are restricted within the confines of the prisons. Some inmates in a minimum security jail are permitted to work at labor camps outside the prisons, which are monitored by prisons guards. Next is the medium security prisons. Medium security prisons are the standards facilities used to house most criminals. They feature cage-style housing, armed guards, and a much more regimented daily routine than minimum security. So, medium security prisons, there are still a lot of security precautions in place. So the inmates have their own cells, but there are more options for them to exit them. So inmates in medium security prisons can participate in therapy programs. Each night, the inmates are secured in their cells, and a bed check and an inmate count are performed to ensure that each inmate is in the correct cell. Although the prison's exterior isn't as guarded as the maximum, it's still difficult to fathom someone escaping. Instead of triple barriers, medium security jails have double fences. And next, high security prisons. So high security prisons are reserved for the most violent and dangerous offenders. These prisons include far more guards than both minimum and medium security, and very little freedom. Each person confined to such a prison is considered to be a high risk individual. High security prisons, or what we call maximum security prisons. So these convicts have a history of violent crimes or have committed violent crimes while in prisons. So these inmates require the highest protection because they are danger to other inmates, prisons, personnel, and society at large. So heavy doors are used to keep convicts shut in their cells at maximum security prisons. They have a window through which they can see and a slat through which the food tray may be inserted a remove. And a jail guard at a control center operates the doors. So inmates spend an average of 23 hours every day in their cells, and they are transported with physical shackles and escorted by numerous officers during the hour they are permitted out. So during their hour off, the convicts are able to shower or exercise. Next is the Sing Sing Prison. What is Sing Sing Prison? Sing Sing name comes from the Indian phrase Sin Sing. It means stone on stone. So Sing Sing Correctional Facility Maximum Security Prisons located in Ossining, New York City. And in this slide, it is one of the oldest prisons in the United States, having been in operation since 1826. And Also, Sing Sing is the one of the country's oldest presence establishment, and it is also one of the most well known in the country, particularly for the severe conditions it endured during the 19th and 20th centuries. And originally known as Mount Pleasant Crescent, it was constructed in the village of Sing Sing on the east bank of the Hudson River, some 30 miles or 48 kilometers north of New York City. And it was designed to provide additional present space and to replace Newgate Present. So the construction was undertaken in 1825 by convict laborers under the supervision of Elam Lenz, warden of Ayuborn State Prisons, and he officially became head of the new prisons when it opened in 1826, though it was not completed until 1828. And there were 800 cells in the first facility. In the mid 19th century, the prison's population grew, necessitating new construction, and the four-story structure was quickly expanded to sixth floor, and the presence eventually held over 1,600 people, due to the fact that most early condemned criminals journeyed to Sing Sing by boat. The expression up the river came to indicate to presence. So, um, this one, that's what I uh, report a while ago, that the initial facility had 800 cells and the population rose in the mid 19th century. That's why the prisons eventually housed more than 1,600 inmates. So, so in this slide, the common punishment at Sing Sing is the whipping and flogging. So, the flogging, also known as whipping or the caning, it is a beating administered with a whip or rod with blows commonly directed to the person's back. It was imposed as a form of judicial punishment, as a means of maintaining discipline in schools, prisons, and also in the military forces, and also in the private homes. So Sing Sing became notorious for its execution. So when we say notorious, it is widely and unfavorably known. Although the electric chair was developed at neighboring uh, Ayuborn, almost all executions within the state were carried out at Sing Sing until 1963. The infamous death chair was later moved on to Green Haven Prison. So in this slide, the electric chair or the death chair is a tool or instrument that used to execute or convicted criminal by sending enough electricity through his body to kill her or him. So the electric chair or the death chair was invented as a humane means of execution. So it was used in New York State in 1890, and the term electric chair was coined the previous year. At that time, the most common way to put a prisoner to death was by hanging, which was increasingly seen as cruel and inhumane. The electric chair was meant to cause death quickly and relatively painlessly, though in US states that still have the death penalty, it's more common today to execute criminals using lethal injection. So in this slide, residents of Sing Sing village changed the name of Osining in 1901, and they intended to separate, if not completely separate, the community from the infamous prison or the Sing Sing prison. The state renamed the jail Osining Correctional Facility in 1970 for the same reason. So let's talk about Ayoborn system. So under of Ayoborn system, there are three classes of prison. So first, always in solitary confinement. So when we say solitary confinement, this is one single cell, and In the solitary confinement, it consists in keeping an inmate alone in a cell for over 22 hours a day because of the harmful effects on the person's physical and mental well-being. Solitary confinement should only be used in exceptional circumstances, and it should be strictly supervised and used only for a limited period of time. So the second one is allowed to work and have occasional free time. So um, the persons work every morning and they come back at night, but they never stop working. So the third one is the largest group work and eat together during the day, separate cells at night. So most groups work on and also they eat together, and every night uh, the guard will separate cells, as what I say, that they separate cells every night. So in this slide, we all know that the Ayuborn system is a harsh punishment, and uh, the Ayuborn is a small individual cells, a big work area for collective labor and enforced silence, where all part of the Ayuborn system prison in New York was established in 1819. So Ayuborn prisons officials devised a system that was nearly the polar opposite of the Eastern Penitentiary. So inside the cells, the prison cells that do not have any contact with the cell blocks exterior walls, and especially the employment of solitary confinement as a form of punishment within the prison was an unpleasant byproduct of the ill-conceived Ayuborn experiment. So, in this slide, silence, corporal punishment, and congregate or collective labor are used to build a disciplinary and administrative framework. So, Ayuborn became a model for jails across the United States in terms of architecture and routine. So, the structure design of Ayuborn's jail, which had inner cells and wings made up of 2 or 4 tiers of cells or cell blocks, established the paradigm for most prisons built in the next 150 years. So, cell blocks are multi-tiered live cells that are normally layered one on top of the other within a hollow structure with no exterior barriers. So, let's move on in Pennsylvania system. So, we all know that the Ayuborn system is the harsh punishment, but the Pennsylvania system is a cool punishment. So in this slide, solitary confinement is a penal strategy based on the idea that produces penitence and encourages reform. The Philadelphia Society for Alleviating the Miseries um, of public presence, whose most active members, Quakers, promoted the idea. So this is so-called separate concept was implemented in 1829 and at the Eastern State Penitentiary on Cherry Hill in Philadelphia. Solitary confinement was practiced in cells that were 16 feet high, approxi- approximately 12 feet long and 7.5 feet broad, 4.9 by 3.7 by 2.3 meters, and each cell had its own exercise yard, which was totally enclosed to prevent inmates from coming into touch. So, in this slide, the Pennsylvania system was an early prison system that required inmates to keep quiet and have private cells and work in those cells. And the Eastern Penitentiary, a presence complex, modeled after the Pennsylvania system, features rows of individual cells connected to corridors and outside cells. So when we say outside cells, these are the presons that are connected to corridor to a corridor and have the rear of the cell facing a peripheral wall. Peripheral wall, it is a exterior or interior wall. So in this slide, the cell blocks were organized like spokes around the hub or central rotunda in the shape of square wheel. And solitary confinement, silence, and labor in outdoor cells were the norm of Eastern. So an exercise yard completely enclosed to prevent contact among prisoners and was attached to each cell, and prisoners saw no one except institution officers and occasional visitors. So solitary penitence, however, was soon modified to include the performance of work such as shoemaking or weaving. The Pennsylvania system separated or spread until it predominated in European presence, and critics in United States argued that it was too costly and had deleterious effects on the minds of the prisoners. So the Pennsylvania system was superseded in the United States by the Audubon system. Let's talk about forms of punishment. So when we say forms of punishment, this may take forms of ranging from capital punishment, flogging, what are those like forced labor and mutilation of the body, to imprisonment and fines. And deferred punishments consist of penalties that are imposed only if an offense is repeated with a specified crime, specified time. So next, capital punishment. So in this slide, since the dawn of civilization, capital punishment, sometimes known as the death penalty, has been employed as a deterrent to crime, and even the most primitive cultures had methods of punishing wrongdoers, including taking their lives to pay for the crimes they committed, according to historical documents. So, this is the most common kind of punishment for murder since the beginning of record history, and a life for a life has been one of the most basic notions for dealing with crime. So next, in this slide, the first type of capital punishments were slow, difficult, and horrific. Lawbreakers were put to death in certain ancient cultures by stoning, crucifixion, burning at the stake, and even being slowly crushed by elephants. And later, communities deemed these tactics to be cruel and odd, and sought out more humane alternatives. The next, in this slide, during the 18th and 19th centuries, legal organizations, diverse, faster, and less painful methods of execution, such as hanging and guillotine, beheading, while these were still brutal and bloody practices that were frequently broadcast in front of enormous crowds, and the final effect was almost always instantaneous, making them appear more sympathetic. Okay, so let's move on to corporal punishment. So, corporal punishment, it is a punishment under the law that includes imprisonment and death. So, for example, any like this physical punishment such as caning or flogging. Corporal punishment or a physical punishment is a punishment which is intended to cause physical pain to a person, and when it is inflicted on minors, especially in home and schooling settings. Its methods may include spanking or padding, when it is inflicted to adults, and it may be inflicted to a prisoners and slaves. So, uh, in this slide, physical punishment, which was frequent in the past and previously, corporal punishment was not restricted to children, and it was also used on adults. So what I said while ago. And since ancient times, whipping has a common form of punishment. Whipping was a popular punishment in England throughout the Middle Ages for minor offenses. Whipping was a popular punishment also in the British Army and Navy in the 18th century. And in 1881, however, it was abolished in the Army and Navy. Then, in this slide, for hundreds of years, corporal punishment has been used, and it was commonly employed by parents and school administrators to punish children, and it is still utilized in these settings in many areas of the world, and it's also used in various criminal justice systems as a kind of punishment for those who break the law. And in many cases of corporal punishments, the element of the shame and humiliation connected with a punishment being performed in a public setting is a part of punishment. So next is provision punishment. Provision is a form of punishment that allows criminals to place back into society on specific conditions. For example, the condition that they keep in contact with their provision officer, and this could be include home visits and inform provision officers of any changes to living conditions of, like for instance, change of address, yeah, like that. And also, in this slide, the origins of provision can be traced back the Middle Ages English law, and adults and children alike were subjected to harsh punishment for acts that were not usually serious, and branding, flagging, mutilation, and execution were all common punishments. So, in this slide, this harshness eventually sparked anger among Progress English Society members concerned about the growth of the justice system. A variety of solutions were designed and adopted slowly but resolutely in an effort to alleviate this harsh punishment. So next is the restitution punishment. So in this slide, a restitution punishment entails the offender making amends for the harm caused by a criminal offense, and the most common offenses for which restitution is employed are theft and property damage. So also, it gives both the victim and the perpetrator greater possibilities to determine what will happen to them once a crime uh, has been committed. And a restitutionary criminal justice system involves a court that takes a problem solving rather than an adversarial approach to justice. And also, courts should serve as a neutral arbiters between different value systems, addressing the harm caused by a conduct rather than its inherent evil, potential deterrent effect, or the offender's rehabilitation. So let's move on to community service. So community service, also known as community restitution, it is a form of punishment intended to benefit by the community that's been harmed by an offender's crime. Judges often order offenders to perform community service in addition to or instead of other forms of punishment such as incarceration, fines, or provision. Then, community service in criminal justice system began in 1966 in California as the way for criminals to pay off traffic fines. And as a result of the program's success, community service has become a popular alternative to jail time across the United States. So, the one benefits of community service is many opportunities for and centered on offenders working inside the community in which they did harm. Across the country, programs are constructing low income housing, cleaning up parks, and planting community gardens because these projects frequently receive little or no money. Criminals' labor permits them to finish. Move on to philosophers of punishments and penology. So the first one is William Penn from 1644 to 1718. So William Penn, he was the founders of Pennsylvania system, and he was confined in the Tower of London for the crime of promoting the faith. And while in prison, William Penn wrote No Cross, No Crown. So No Cross, No Crown is one of the chief works of William Penn. He first published in 1669, and it was written during Penn's imprisonment in Tower of London and influenced the Great Act of 1682 through which the Pennsylvania Quakers reduced capital offenses to the single crime of all corporal punishment. So during this youth, Penn traveled widely throughout Europe and served in the Royal Navy and studied law. And in 1667, he converted to the Quaker faith, and by next year, he found himself confined in the Tower of London as punishment for promoting the faith. And Penn's influence on the criminal law of the United States and on the coming age of imprisonment was most visible in Great Act of 1682. And uh, throughout the single piece of legislation, the Pennsylvania Quakers reduced capital offenses to the one crime of premeditated murder and abolished all corporal punishment as they had existed under the English Code. He was the first notable presence reformer among Quakers, and he eliminated capital punishment for all crimes, save murder, in his great experiment in Pennsylvania in the 1680s. In addition, he claimed that prisons shall be workhouses, that bail should be permitted for small offenses, and that all persons shall be free in terms of fees, food, and accommodation. And also, he provided for rehabilitation by requiring that inmates be assisted in learning a trade so that they might earn a living when they were freed. For his day, they were significant reforms, putting his Quaker conviction in equality and the possibility of fostering that of God in everyone into practice. Okay, so let's move on to Jeremy Bentham from 1746 to 1832. So, Bentham was born February 15, 1748 in Houndsditch near London into a family of attorneys. So, um, Bentham advocated utilitarianism, the principle that the highest objective of public policy is the greatest happiness for the largest number of people. So, Bentham's idea that people are motivated by pleasure and pain, and that proper amount of punishment can deter crime became known as hedonistic calculus. So, the one who desired the ultimate panoptical presence was Jeremy Bentham. And panoptical prison, it is a type of institutional building and a system of control designed by the English philosopher and social theorist. So Bentham, is also known as the inventor of the panoptical or the panopticon, a type of prison he proposed building in England as early as 1787. So the key to the panopticon was its unique architecture, which consisted of a circular turret design with a glass roof and with a window on the outside wall of each cell. And the design made it easy for prison staff in a tower in the center of the structure to observe every cell. And the panopticon, also called in an inspection house, was intended to be a progressive and humanitarian penitentiary. So after years of personally promoting the concept, Bentham saw his idea for an innovative penitentiary die. So the concept may have fallen victim to the growing emphasis on transportation, which delay all present construction in England. So Bentham argues that everyone implicitly or openly agrees to this concept, which requires every one of us to weigh the benefits and drawbacks of an activity we are considering. Move on to John Howard from 1726 to 1790. So John Howard was born in Hackney in East London in 1726, the son of a partner in an upholstery business. On his father's death in 1742, he inherited considerable wealth and settled on an estate in Bedfordshire. So John Howard was born to a deeply religious English family, and on a trip to Portugal as a young man, Howard was taken prisoner by pirates when the British merchant ship on which he was traveling was captured a French privateer. So he and his fellow passengers were kept below deck in subhuman conditions, and when they arrived in France, he was imprisoned in French dungeon, but he was later released in exchange for a French naval officer. So uh, in 1773, Howard was appointed High Sheriff of Bedfordshire. So he was shocked at the abysmal conditions in English jails of the time, and he set out on a quiz of prisons reform. And also, um, the the John Howard great greatest legacy was his 1777 work, The State of Prisons in England and Wales, in which he described the abysmal state of English prison. So, the state of prison also contained descriptions of clean and well-run institutions, prisons in which the sexes were separated, and jails in which inmates were kept busy at productive work. So, many of the principles described in Howard's book later became the foundation for the English Penitentiary Act of 1779, which established a decisive shift toward the use of imprisonment rather than transportation and capital punishment. Let's move on to Immanuel Kant from 1724 to 1804. Immanuel Kant, guilt is a necessary condition for the right inflicting of punishment. According to Kant, and punishment of the innocent is a moral and conceptual problem, and Kant also opposed private retribution, vigilant actions, war, and any other activity that permits a disputant to evaluate his own case and punish according to his own biased conclusion in order to avoid such punishment. Criminal punishment is coercive social authority in its most harsh domestic form, and it's imperative that is administered exclusively through the processes of due process found in just rule or found in a just rule of a law or in order to maintain freedom. Such methods obstruct the utilitarian goals of crime control and criminal rehabilitation. However, Kant claims that this is the cause of liberty and justice. There are different types of criminal punishment. So the following are five of the most commonly seen types of criminal punishment. So the first one is incapacitation. So incapacitation, the theory of incapacitation assumes that the state has a duty to protect the public from future wrong or harms, and that such protection can be afford, afforded through some form of incarceration or incapacitation, and also it prevents future crime by disabling or restricting the offender's liberty and their movements or ability to commit a further wrong. And the most extreme form of incapacitating punishment is the death penalty, but there are several other forms including imprisonment, curfews, house arrest or electric monitoring, and disqualification from driving for drinking. And then incapacitation also refers to the act of rendering a person incapable of criminal conduct by execution or banishment, and more recently by assassination or incarceration for long periods of time. Used in cases involving dungeons offenders such as those charged with murder and who are likely to conduct serious and violent crimes if not restrained. Banishment was a prevalent punishment in ancient times, and later prisoners and undesirables were frequently shipped overseas by conquering European governments. House arrest, jail, and the death sentence are all examples of incapacitation in modern times. And banishment is a type of legal penalty that forces a defendant or a person charged with committing crime and to leave a specific city, country, or state. And exile or deportation are terms used to describe the process of removing a defendant from society. And also, banishment is a punishment for wrongdoing, has roots in virtually all of the ancient world cultures. The ancient applications of banishment was particularly effective because it ensured that a criminal would be removed from his family and doomed to wander the wilderness, and the threat of being exiled to a place far away from any civilized villages or kingdoms served as a power deterrent to criminal activity. So the early American colonists also relied on banishment as a method of legal punishment. Often, colonists were exiled from an area for religious reasons, and is deterrence. So deterrence has often criticized for being neither effective or morally acceptable. So um, the punishment deters potential offenders from committing future crimes. Furthermore, deterrence allows for punishment to be imposed that are disproportionate to the harms done, for the innocent to be punished and for the punishment of crimes that have not been committed. So there are four types of deterrence are generally recognized. So deterrence, individual or specific, and general deterrence. So when we say individual deterrence, it refers to the aim of imposing punishment to deter individuals who have already offended from doing so again. So in individual deterrence, it focuses more on the individual who committed the crime rather than on the crime itself. So the purpose of specific deterrence is to discourage that individual in particular from reoffending or committing another crime in the future. When it comes to sentencing an individual, a judge will ideally impose a sentence um, that will achieve the goals of both specific deterrence and general deterrence. So that way, the punishment will not only discourage the individual from committing another crime in the future, so it will also discourage others from committing the same or a similar crime. So, okay, next is the general deterrence. It justifies the imposition of punishment to deter other potential offenders. The logic of this theory is that if the imposition of criminal punishment deters people from committing crimes, then the general public can enjoy a greater sense of safety and security. So, in general deterrence, it refers to the practice of instilling fear in people to those hopes that such fear will prevent them from committing crimes in the future. So this is done by making an example of offenders through their punishments. The focus is not on the offender individually, rather, the individual is punished publicly to prevent others who may have similar ideas from committing similar crimes in the future. Okay, next is the marginal deterrence. So next is marginal deterrence. So it seeks to reconcile how effective different types of punishment are as either specific or general deterrence. So marginal deterrence concerns that incentives created by criminal penalties for offenders to refrain from committing more harmful acts. We show that when offenders act sequentially, it is often optimal for the level of the sanction, not just the expected sanction, to rise when the severity of the act, even when enforcement is specific. So, in marginal deterrence, it refers to the idea that a severe crime should receive a punishment that is just as severe, and that a lesser crime should receive a lesser punishment. Um, it should receive a lesser punishment. So further, a series of crimes should receive a harsher punishment than any single crime. So for example, if a robbery that is committed without violence is punished similar similarly to a robbery that involves murder, then a robber could make the decision to kill his victims to prevent him um, them from offering testimony at a criminal trial that would ultimately convict him. So, in marginal deterrence, it meant to deter a criminal from committing multiple crimes. Without it, an offender may commit the initial crime, then commit further crimes such as blackmailing, law enforcement to cover up the initial crime. So, next is partial deterrence. So, it refers to the situation in which the threat of penalty has some deterrent. What event when someone engaged in illegal behavior, for example, a criminal simply robbing a victim instead of also causing physical harm. So, in partial deterrence, it is refers to the situation in which the threat of sanction has some deterrent valued even when the sanction threats do not lead to law-abiding behavior. Then, the effectiveness of deterrence as a criminal punishment is difficult to assess because people may follow the law for other reasons that may challenging to track such as religious or moral beliefs, physical incapacitation, or lack of opportunity. Okay, so the imperial efforts to assess the effectiveness of deterrence are limited by several basic factors. So the first, persons may abide by laws or desist in deviant behavior for variety of response um, other than the looming threat or fear of legal sanctions. So some of these non-deterrence constraints on behavior include one's moral or ethical principles and religious beliefs, physical inability to commit the deviant act, and lack of opportunity. Next is the retribution. As one of the oldest forms of punishment, retribution has roots in the Judeo-Christian tradition of justice. So, modern examples of retribution include the widespread practices of imposing fines as well as enforcing mandatory sentencing policies for certain offenses under the law. So, as an effective punishment, retribution has been she criticized as being overly rigid and limited in its capacity to change societal behavior. However, it remains popular. So, retribution, it prevents future crime by removing the desire for personal avengement in the form of assault, battery, and criminal homicide. So, for example, against the defendant, when victims or society discover that the defendant has been adequately punished for a crime, so they achieve a certain satisfaction for our criminal procedure is working effectively, which enhances faith in law enforcement and our government. The primary goal of retribution in its original form, it is to ensure that punishments are proportionate to the seriousness of the crimes committed, regardless of the individual differences between offenders, other than means rea and an understanding of moral culpability. So the retribution focuses on the past offense rather than the offender. So next is the rehabilitation. So a common present policy in America up until the 1970s, rehabilitation focuses on helping criminals and prisoners overcome the barriers that led them to committing criminal acts. So the most recently formulated theory of punishment is that of rehabilitation, the idea that the purpose of punishment is to apply treatment and training to the offender so that he is made capable of returning to society and functioning as law-abiding member of the community. So in in rehabilitation, it prevents future crime by altering a defendant's behavior. Examples of rehabilitation include educational and vocational programs, treatment center placement, and counseling. So, the court can combine rehabilitation with incarceration or with probation or parole. So, in some states, for example, nonviolent drug offenders must participate in rehabilitation in combination with probation rather than submitting to incarceration. So, this lightens the load of jails and prisons while lowering recidivism, which means reoffending. So the next one is restoration. So it is a radically different approach to criminal punishment. The goal of restoration is for the offender to make direct amends to both the victim and community in which the crime was committed. Although a relatively new practice in modern times, the concept of restorative justice can be found in the early legal systems of Western Europe, ancient Hebrew justice, and pre-colonial African societies. During the process of restoration, victims initiate a process in which both they and the offender meet to share feelings and concerns. The dialogue offers victims the opportunity to be heard and the offender to make amends and receive forgiveness. Restorative justice is often used in crimes involving youth offenders. So, in restoration, this new approach to criminal justice calls for the offender to make direct amends to the victim of their crime, as well as the community where the crime occurred. So judges use this approach mostly with juvenile offenders, and in this approach, the criminal and the victim meet so that the offender can hear what the victim says about their experiences with the crime committed. So the offender then strives to make amends and seek forgiveness. So this theory are intricately involved in studies on the types of crimes and their punishments. Society develop each of them with the idea of ensuring appropriate punishment for criminals and safety for society. So let's talk about the Age of Enlightenment. So when we say Age of Enlightenment, it is the period of changes. And in Age of Enlightenment, it was thought during the Enlightenment that the human reasoning could discover truths about the world, religion, and the politics and culture used to improve the lives of humankind. So skepticism about the received wisdom was another important ideas. Everything was to be subjected to testing and uh, rational analysis, religious tolerance, and the idea that individuals should be free from coercion in their personal lives and consciences were also Enlightenment ideas. So, the Age of Enlightenment, also known as the Enlightenment, was a philosophical movement that dominated the world of ideas in Europe in the 18th century, centered on the idea that reason is the primary source of authority and legitimacy. This movement and advocated such ideals as liberty, progress, tolerance, fraternity, constitutional government, and separation of church and state. So the Enlightenment was marked by an emphasis on the scientific method and reductionism, along with increased questioning of religious orthodoxy. The core ideas advocated by modern democracies, including the civil society, human and civil rights, and separation of powers, are product of the Enlightenment. So religious orthodoxy, it is from Greek orthodox, of the right opinion through doctrine and its adherents, as opposed to the heterodox or heretical doctrines under adherence. The word was the first used in early 4th century Christianity by the Greek fathers. So this there is little consensus on the precise beginning of the Age of Enlightenment, but the beginning of the 18th century 1701 or the middle of the 17th century 1650 are commonly identified as starting points. French historians usually place the period between 1715 and 1789. The Age of Enlightenment was an important time in history of the world and modern Western societies. The Age of Enlightenment, or just the Enlightenment, occurred during the 18th century and also known as a time period of great change and new ideas. Specifically, the Enlightenment involved an intellectual movement in which famous thinkers and philosophers challenged some of the basic foundations of society, including rule of the government, basic human nature, sources of authority, and ideas centered on liberty. So, the Enlightenment built on the earlier work on the scientific revolution, which occurred in the centuries before the Enlightenment, and the scientific revolution involved a movement in society towards modern science based on the using logic and reason to come to informed conclusions. So, Enlightenment thinkers would then apply these same values to society and authority and began uh, to question all aspects of societal structure. Okay, so let's move on to the personalities behind correctional institutions. So the first one is Cesare Beccaria, 1738 to 1794. So, Cesar Beccaria is an Italian writer during the Age of Enlightenment. He believed that the objective of punishment should be deterrence and that the effectiveness of punishment was based on certainty, not severity. He was largely responsible for major criminal reforms in Europe and America. So, in Beccaria's view, the purpose of punishment is to deter the offender from committing the crime again and to discourage others from ever committing the crime. Beccaria opposes capital punishment except under very restricted circumstances, and he argues that torture should never be used against an accused whose guilt has not been officially established. Other sanctions discussed are imprisonment and banishment. So, on crimes and punishment combines elements from social contract theory with utilitarian positions. It touches on many aspects of law and justice in a rapid, impassionate style, completely abjuring legal technicalities, and the penalties themselves should be carefully proportioned to the corresponding crimes and calibrated to deliver the minimum of punishment necessary, and Beccaria sought in all cases to minimize or abolish the use of violence and the infliction of the pain. So, Cesar Beccaria argued against the use of torture in the gathering of evidence, highlighting its absurdity, and against the death penalty, emphasizing its failure to deter. So, um, as what I understand, Cesar Beccaria is an author of Crimes and Punishment. And Beccaria's summary statement on crimes and punishment, that in order that any punishment should not be act of violence committed by one person or many against a private citizen. It is an essential that it should be public, prompt, necessary, that the minimum possible under the given circumstances, proportionate to the crimes and established by law. In vicarious view, the purpose of punishment is to deter the offender from committing the crime again and to discourage others from even committing the crime. And punishment severity should be based primarily on the harm the offense has caused rather than the intent of the offender, and it should not be more severe than is required to achieve deterrence. So Beccaria opposes capital punishment except under very restricted circumstances, and he argues that torture should never be used against an accused whose guilt has not been officially established, and other sanctions discussed are imprisonment and banishment. Particularly, types of offender are considered in terms of severity. Cesar Lombroso from 1835 to 1901. He described a father of modern criminology. Cesar Lombroso's theory of the born criminal dominated thinking about criminal behavior in the late 19th and early 20th century. He was the founder of the Italian school of positivist criminology. He rejected the established classical school, which held that crime has a characteristic trait of human nature and that rational choices were the foundation of behavior. So I will read Cesar Lombroso's um, theory. After that, I will discuss. Then, Lombroso, using a scientific approach and concept drawn from physiognomy, early eugenics, psychiatry, and social Darwinism, argued that criminality was inherited and that the born criminal could be identified by physical defects which confirm a criminal as savage or atavistic, while his particular identifying characteristics are no longer considered valid. The idea of factors that predispose certain individuals to commit crime continues to be foundational to work in criminology. Together with his emphasis on the scientific method, this revolutionary approach has earned Lombroso the little father of scientific criminology. So, um, Cesar Lombroso is the father of criminology, and he also established classical school. and and during Cesar Lombroso's time, crime is not a sin, and he was very judgmental on his time, and he believing essentially that criminality was inherited and that criminals could be identified physical attributes such as hawk-like noses and bloodshot eyes. Lombroso was one of the first people in history to use scientific method to study crime. He was the first published in 1876, and he suggests that there was distinct biological class of people that were prone to criminality. These people exhibited atavistic, or example, primitive features. Atavistic derives from the word avatos, which means ancestor in Latin. So this atavistic characteristic, he argued, denoted the fact that the offenders were at more primitive stage of evolution than non-offenders. They were genetic throwbacks, and this made them, according to Lombroso, wilder, untamed, and unable to fit in the 1870 society. Therefore, they would inevitably torn to crime, and this implies that criminality is inherited and that it can be identified by physical defects. The atavistic form is like features of the thief, like expressive of the face, manual dexterity, and small wandering eyes. And the features of murderer, like example, glassy stares, bloodshot eyes, and big hawk-like nose. The next is features of sex offenders, like thick lips and protruding ears. And then next is the features of women offenders, like shorter and more wrinkled, darker hair, and smaller skulls than normal women. William the Conqueror, 1028 to 1087. He was one of the greatest soldiers and rulers of the Middle Ages. He made himself the mightiest noble in France and then changed the course of England's history by conquest of that country. So the Norman conquest of England, uh, it must be said that William was rather lucky in his invasion of England because his enemy Harold II was obliged to face another invasion just a few weeks before the conqueror arrived. Then, things to know about William the Conqueror. He was also known as William the Bastard, not as we might imagine today in a nod to his nasty behavior, but because he was born in 1028 to unmarried parents to Robert I, Duke of Normandy, and his mistress, Herleva. This fact led to him being touted as a child. And next, he gained a reputation for brutality. And after defeating a rebellion in Normandy, led by his cousin, William laid the foundations of his reputation as a brutal leader, cutting off the hands and feet of the rebels as punishment. Reco Ferry from 1856 to 1929. So first, I will read all about Enrico Ferri's theory and then I will discuss. So Enrico Ferri is an Italian criminologist who was ahead of his time. Ferri rejected these beliefs known as biological determinism in favor of examining the role of social and environmental factors in crime. This is an example of the nature versus nurture debate. For example, the debate over whether an individual's behavior or character is innate or result of experience. Ferri focused much more on the nurture side of the debate, and was born in Lombard in 1856 and worked first as a lecturer and later as a professor of criminal law. Having spent time as a student of Cesare Lombroso, Ferri focused more on social and economic influences on the criminal and crime rates, and Ferri at the time, a radical, was elected to Italian parliament in 1886. In 1893, he joined the Italian Socialist Party and edited their daily newspaper, the Avante. In 1900 and 1901, he spoke out in Congress against the rules of socialist minister in bourgeois governments. Ferri favored Italian neutrality during the World War and he was re-elected as a Socialist Party deputy in 1921, and in post-war Italy, he became a supporter of Mussolini's fascist regime. Ferri died in 1929. So as we all know that in Enrico Ferri is an Italian criminologist, was ahead of his time, and Ferri rejected those beliefs known as biological determinism in favor of examining the role of social and environmental factors in crime. So this is an example of the nature versus nurture. So for example, the debate over whether an individual's behavior or character is innate or a result of experience. Ferry focused much more on the nurture side of the debate. So 80% of nurture and then 20% of nature. So the last one is Clifford Rube Show from 1895 to 1957. He was an American sociologist and criminologist. He was a major figure in the Chicago School of Sociology during the 1930s and 1940s and is considered to be one of the most influential figures in American criminology. And his work on juvenile delinquency with Henry D. MK, conducted in the late 1920s, played a pivotal role in moving the study of such delinquency toward the discipline of sociology and away from psychology and psychiatry. Shaw and MK's work spanned three general areas: studying geographic variation in rates of juvenile delinquency, the study of autobiographical works by delinquency, and the development of the Chicago Area Project and a delinquency prevention program in the Chicago area. And there are the two studies published by Shaw and MK in the 1930s and 1940s were still held in high regard among the social scientists in the 1970s. So, Clifford Rube Shaw was focused juvenile delinquency or juvenile delinquent, and and he was a major figure in Chicago of sociology during the 1930s and 1940s, and considered to be one of the most influential figures in American criminology. And his work on on what I said a while ago, that juvenile delinquency with Henry D. MK, that they conducted in the late 1920s, played a played in pivotal role in moving the study of such delinquency toward the discipline of sociology and away from psychology and psychiatric. So, Shaw and MK's work span the three regional areas, and then the study of autographical works by delinquents, and the development of the Chicago Area Project and delinquency prevention program in the Chicago area. Social disorganization theory was developed by two sociologists, Clifford Shaw and Henry MK, who were connected to the Chicago School of Criminology due to the social conflicts affecting Chicago. Shaw and MK examined predominant rates of crime and delinquency. Creators theorize that disorganized communities are affected by poverty, in which crimes rates and neighborhood ecological characteristics are directly related. So, sociologists establish social structure theories in their efforts to connect behavior patterns to social economic control, as well as the additional social ecological factors. Moreover, the theory of social disorganization state a person's physical and social environmental physically is primarily responsible for the behavioral choices that a person makes. So that would be all. Thank you and God bless.